On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped out of an odd-looking spaceship and into the pages of history as the first man on the moon.
For more than 50 years, Neil Armstrong kept one secret closer than the rest, a truth he never fully shared, even as the world hailed him as a hero.
Neil was sincere. He always felt and said 500,000 people who made it possible what we did.
Now, decades after that fateful one small step, whispers of his final confession have reignited questions once thought settled.
All 9 of us signed in under the name of Max Peck. Then there was this young fellow. He was a fellow by the name of Neil Armstrong.
What did the first man on the moon really see up there? And why did he stay silent for so long? The truth, it seems, never stopped orbiting. Did he really see the moon up close? The world deserves the truth. Truth before Armstrong's death. In July 1969, millions of people watched Neil Armstrong step off a fragile ladder and onto the surface of the moon. It was a moment that seemed to freeze the planet. One small step, one giant leap, and one collective breath held in awe. The world erupted in celebration. Cameras flashed, radios buzzed, and in living rooms across continents, children stared at grainy screens believing they had just witnessed the impossible. Then, slowly, something curious happened. The man who had just become the most famous human alive, the first to set foot on another world, started to disappear. While his face remained on postage stamps and school posters, Neil Armstrong himself retreated into silence. No book tours, no talk show circuits, no parade of autobiographies or late-night interviews. For someone who had just made history, his quiet withdrawal felt, to many, like the second great mystery of the 20th century. That silence became fertile ground for doubt. In the years that followed, as conspiracy theories about the moon landing began to spread, Armstrong's private nature was interpreted as evidence. Why wouldn't he talk? Skeptics asked. Why does he look uncomfortable every time he's asked about it? In grainy recordings of public appearances, Armstrong's modest, clipped replies seemed to invite more questions than they answered. He wasn't defensive, just restrained. A man who seemed uneasy in the spotlight history had thrust upon him. But to understand Armstrong's silence, you have to understand the man behind it. A man built not for fame, but for precision. Neil Alden. Armstrong was a pilot long before he was a symbol. He logged over 1,000 hours as a test pilot, pushing experimental aircraft to the limits of physics. In that world, words mattered less than calculations, and confidence was measured not in charisma, but in control. When NASA selected its astronauts, Armstrong fit the mold perfectly: calm, analytical, and allergic to drama. Colleagues often said Armstrong treated risk like math, something to be studied, not feared. To him, the moon landing wasn't a mythic triumph. It was the final stage of a well-executed plan. That's partly why his post-mission fame unsettled him. Where the public saw poetry, Armstrong saw procedure. Where the world saw divine destiny, he saw engineering. So, when journalists sought sweeping emotional statements or confessions of awe, Armstrong's matter-of-fact answers felt cold, even evasive. But that detachment wasn't guilt. It was discipline. Yet in a culture hungry for heroes, discipline can look like distance. The rise of doubt. By the mid-70s, a different kind of story began taking shape. A few self-styled skeptics started questioning the authenticity of the moon landings. They pointed to odd shadows in photos, waving flags, missing stars. Television specials fanned the flames, and public trust in institutions, already shaken by Watergate and Vietnam, began to crumble. And at the center of that doubt was Neil Armstrong, silent as ever. When his fellow astronaut Buzz Aldrin appeared in interviews, he came across as energetic and outspoken, almost defiant towards skeptics. Armstrong, on the other hand, declined most invitations. He gave only a handful of interviews in the decades after Apollo 11. often steering the conversation towards science, education, or the future of exploration, never the past. For some, that restraint became proof. The first man on the moon, unwilling to talk about the moon. What else could that mean? Conspiracy culture thrived on that void. But there's another, quieter explanation. Maybe Armstrong understood that no explanation could compete with people's need to doubt. Once disbelief takes hold, facts alone rarely move it. There's something almost cruel about history's obsession with firsts. To be the first means to be remembered not as a person, but as a symbol. Armstrong didn't just walk on the moon, he became the embodiment of human ambition. But symbols can't live like people. Friends and colleagues have said that Armstrong was proud of what he accomplished, but never comfortable with being celebrated for it. He saw the moon landing as a collective victory, thousands of engineers, technicians, and dreamers working in sync. Yet the world only wanted one name, one face, his. In that sense, his silence wasn't avoidance, it was humility. Armstrong once told reporters he didn't see himself as a hero, but as a white-collar test pilot doing his job. That kind of modesty sounds almost unbelievable today, but it was genuine. And maybe that's what confounded people the most. Because, in an age built on spectacle, Armstrong's refusal to perform looked suspicious. By the time he died in 2012, Armstrong had become a paradox. One of the most recognized men on Earth, and one of the least understood. His measured tone, his reluctance to join anniversary celebrations, even his rare smiles in public, all were folded into a narrative he never authored. The truth is simpler, and maybe sadder. Armstrong was a man who had reached the pinnacle of human exploration and found that the noise afterward was louder than the silence of space. He wasn't hiding a secret. He was protecting a piece of peace that fame could never give back. Still, that quiet has power. It's the same silence that keeps people wondering, decades later, if there was something more behind that famous step. Maybe not a confession, just a truth too simple for conspiracy, too human for headlines, that sometimes, after changing the world, there's nothing left to say. Did he say he needed to tell the truth? He stayed silent and retreated from the sudden fame. Why not continue as an astronaut celebrity after a global breakthrough? Life after the moon landing. When Neil Armstrong returned to Earth, he was the most famous man alive, a walking symbol of everything humanity had ever dared to dream. But almost as soon as the parades ended, he began to do something no one expected. He stepped out of the spotlight. After the whirlwind of interviews, banquets, and the global Giant Leap tour that took him across 25 countries, Armstrong quietly turned away from the stage. While his fellow astronauts leaned into public life, Buzz Aldrin became a tireless speaker and advocate for space exploration. Armstrong did the opposite. He stopped accepting interview requests, declined commercial offers, and retreated from the orbit of celebrity. In 1971, just 2 years after Apollo 11, Armstrong resigned from NASA. The man who had flown higher than anyone else now wanted a quieter life closer to home. He took a teaching position at the University of Cincinnati, where he spent nearly a decade instructing students in aerospace engineering. His students described him as calm, exacting, and humble, never mentioning the moon unless someone else brought it up. In his classroom, he was not the first man on the moon. He was simply Professor Armstrong. That transition baffled many. In an age that rewarded fame, Armstrong seemed immune to it. His name could have sold books, led corporations, or filled lecture halls, yet he avoided all of it. He turned down endorsement deals, refused to be a brand ambassador, and stayed away from political life. Even NASA's public affairs officers found him elusive. He preferred to speak only when the subject was science or education. To the public, that restraint looked almost suspicious. The world had crowned him a hero, but he refused to act like one. His rare interviews, so few they can be counted on one hand, only deepened the mystery. When he finally appeared on 60 Minutes in 2005, His words were careful and unembellished. "I don't want to be a celebrity. I just happen to be at the right place at the right time." That humility was real. To Armstrong, Apollo 11 wasn't about personal triumph. It was about engineering precision, the combined effort of thousands who made the mission possible. He once said he was a white-collar test pilot doing his job, and that's exactly how he carried himself, as a man of science, not spectacle. But that quiet dignity had an unintended consequence. His silence left space, a vacuum of its own, and into it, people began to project doubts. During the 70s, when public trust in government was eroding after Vietnam and Watergate, conspiracy theories started to find an audience. If the world could be lied to about politics, why not space? Armstrong's withdrawal from public life became an easy narrative hook. Why wouldn't the first man on the moon talk about his greatest achievement? Why did he look uncomfortable on stage? In truth, Armstrong wasn't avoiding questions, he was avoiding noise. He had seen how quickly the meaning of Apollo 11 was reduced to headlines, stripped of the complexity he admired. He often said that what fascinated him most wasn't the moon itself, but what the mission proved about human ingenuity. Yet even that perspective couldn't compete with the growing appetite for drama. By the time the Apollo 11th anniversaries rolled around, the 20th, the 30th, even the 40th, Armstrong remained notably absent from television specials. He attended some private NASA events, yes, but refused nearly all major public retrospectives. His fellow astronauts joked that Armstrong had landed on the moon and then disappeared into it. To NASA insiders, that privacy was part of his character. To conspiracy theorists, it became part of the myth. What Armstrong viewed as humility, others read as hesitation. And in the shadows of that misunderstanding, the seeds of doubt began to grow. Doubt not only about the man, but about the moon landing itself. What really happened up there? Before it became a global legend, the moon landing was a checklist of calculations, deadlines, and relentless trial and error. It wasn't a miracle. It was a mission born from pressure, precision, and ambition. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and declared that the United States would send a man to the moon and return him safely before the decade was out. It was a promise wrapped in the Cold War's urgency, an answer to the Soviet Union's early space triumphs. The challenge was staggering. Build a rocket powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity, a spacecraft sturdy enough to endure the void, and a plan smart enough to bring human beings 250,000 miles away and home again. That plan became the Apollo program, a series of missions designed to test, fail, and refine every step toward the moon. But the road there was not smooth. In 1967, tragedy struck when a fire inside the Apollo 1 command module killed 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, during a pre-flight test. The disaster forced NASA to rebuild its systems from the ground up. Every wire, every seal, every switch was reevaluated. The loss was devastating, but it hardened the agency's resolve. When Apollo 11's turn came 2 years later, the program had been transformed into the most rigorously tested operation in human history. At the heart of it all was the towering Saturn V rocket, the largest and most powerful machine ever built by humankind. Standing 363 feet tall and producing 7.6 million pounds of thrust, it was more skyscraper than spacecraft. On top sat the Apollo spacecraft, made up of 3 parts: the command module, where the astronauts would live and return home; the service module, which provided oxygen, water, and propulsion; and the lunar module, the fragile, spider-like craft that would actually touch the moon. It was a mechanical masterpiece, designed not for beauty, but survival. On the morning of July 16, 1969, hundreds of thousands of spectators crowded Florida's beaches as countdown began. At 9:32 a.m., a blinding flame erupted beneath the rocket, and the Saturn V slowly lifted off, shaking the Earth as it rose. Inside, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were pinned to their seats, their voices calm as they called out each stage of ascent. 12 minutes later, Apollo 11 reached Earth orbit. 90 minutes after that, the rocket's third stage reignited, pushing the spacecraft free of gravity's hold and setting it on a course for the moon. For 3 days, the crew drifted through the silent darkness between worlds. They took photos, checked instruments, and looked back at the distant Earth, no larger than a coin against a field of black. The journey was methodical, almost meditative, until July 20th, when the most dangerous phase began. The lunar module, named Eagle, separated from the main spacecraft and began its descent toward the moon's surface. Michael Collins remained in orbit, alone in the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin guided the small lander toward a flat area called the Sea of Tranquility. What followed was 9 minutes of tension that would become legend. Midway through descent, computer alarms began flashing unfamiliar codes: 1201, 1202. The messages meant that the onboard computer was overloaded. Engineers in Houston made a split-second call. The system was stable enough to continue. As they neared the surface, Armstrong noticed that the designated landing site was strewn with boulders. With only seconds of fuel left, he switched to manual control and searched for a safe spot. The world waited in silence as telemetry data flickered across screens in mission control. Then, at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, Armstrong's voice broke through the static. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed in Houston." Applause erupted. Across the planet, millions of people exhaled in relief. Humanity had done it. 6 hours later, the hatch opened. This is the critical part: who really stepped on the moon's surface? It was Armstrong who descended the ladder, his boots touching dust no human had ever seen up close. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he said, words that would outlive him, outlive the century. Aldrin soon joined him, describing the lunar surface as magnificent desolation. For the next 2.5 hours, they walked, worked, and collected samples. 47 pounds of lunar rock that scientists would later confirm bore no resemblance to anything found on Earth. They planted the American flag, not as a claim, but as a marker of achievement, and left behind a plaque reading, "We came in peace for all mankind." Meanwhile, Collins orbited above, circling the moon every 2 hours, his radio silent whenever he passed behind the far side. In those moments, he was the most isolated human in existence. Later, he would write that he felt not loneliness, but awe, aware that while Armstrong and Aldrin were making history below, his role was to ensure they made it home. After roughly 21 hours on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin fired the ascent engine, reconnecting with Collins. The three men reunited, then fired their main engine to escape the moon's gravity and begin the long trip home. 3 days later, on July 24th, Apollo 11 plunged through Earth's atmosphere, its heat shield glowing brighter than molten metal as it absorbed temperatures over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Moments later, parachutes deployed, and the capsule splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The mission lasted 8 days, 3 hours, and 18 minutes. The world had changed. The United States had achieved what Kennedy promised, and what most of humanity had only imagined. The Soviet Union, watching from afar, acknowledged the triumph with respect. Even for those who doubted the politics, the sight of humans walking on the moon was undeniable proof of what cooperation, science, and courage could achieve. Everything about Apollo 11 was documented: recorded telemetry data, radar tracking, live radio transmissions, photographs, and television feeds monitored by multiple countries, including those not allied with the U.S. The Soviets themselves tracked the mission from start to finish. If it had been staged, they would have been the first to expose it. The evidence of Apollo's success was, and remains, overwhelming. Lunar rocks were distributed to scientists worldwide, each sample confirming the same extraterrestrial origin. Decades later, lunar orbiters would photograph the exact landing sites, showing footprints, rover tracks, and equipment left behind. Even now, scientists on Earth can aim lasers at retroreflectors placed on the Moon by Apollo astronauts, and those mirrors still send light back, a quiet, eternal signal that humans were truly there. In the end, the truth of what happened up there doesn't need defending. The evidence isn't hidden in secret files or blurred footage. It's in the physics, the data, and the Moon itself. What Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins accomplished wasn't just a victory for the United States. It was proof that human determination could overcome limits once thought absolute. The real miracle of Apollo 11 isn't wrapped in mystery. It lies in the thousands of minds that worked in perfect synchrony long before launch day, all believing in the same impossible idea, that one day people would look up at the night sky and know we've been there. Neil Armstrong's legacy is not just that he was the first man to walk on the Moon, but that he carried humanity's quiet courage into the unknown. His calm precision, humility, and lifelong refusal to glorify himself turned him into something rarer than a hero, a symbol of discipline and integrity. The Apollo 11 mission proved what collaboration and belief in science could achieve. But Armstrong's silence afterward reminded the world that greatness doesn't always speak loudly. His small step endures as proof that the limits we imagine are only temporary until someone dares to cross them. Some truths take a lifetime to surface. Stay with us, subscribe, and don't miss what history finally reveals next.